doing in Northern California. I'm going to present, my presentation is about 25 minutes long, but feel free to add questions to the chat throughout the talk. I think we're going to have lots of time for Q&A at the end. So again, I'm Kendall. I'm the Director of Partnerships and New Programming with GreenWave. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We work across coasts in North America to train and support regenerative ocean farmers. And we do this by identifying barriers to growth, developing solutions, and disseminating best practices back to the field through our 4 program areas, concentrating on training support, climate subsidies, market development through value chain coordination, and farmer infrastructure like modular, scalable nursery tech and stabilization technology. Today, though, I'm going to talk about some of our work that's a little bit on the fringes of our other programming, and really a joint project and multi-year collaboration between the Nature Conservancy California Oceans Program, Hog Island Oyster Company, Cal Poly Humboldt, Sunken Seaweed, and many others. So we're going to talk about piloting bull kelp cultivation strategies to support kelp restoration and recovery in California. Now, I know most of you are probably joining from the West Coast, joining from California, since this is the kelp culture talk, but just so that we're all on the same page, and in case there are folks joining from other regions, when I'm talking about bull kelp, I'm talking about Nereocystis lupkiana. It has a habitat range in the Eastern Pacific from the Aleutian Islands to Southern California. It's a subtidal to low intertidal species that prefers semi-exposed and high current areas. And it's an annual, though some populations will persist over multiple years. The stipe grows incredibly fast, up to 30 meters in a single growing season, and it has a gas-filled nematocyst to really bring those blades up to the surface and allow it to be a canopy-forming species. So unlike Macrocystis that you would see farther south in California, bull kelp canopy is really concentrated at the surface, and it provides habitat for many species, red abalone, fish, and mammals, to name a few. But the population along the California coastline is really in decline. Over 96% of the population has essentially disappeared since 2014 due to a number of compounding factors: the blob and warming waters, urchin predation, sea star wasting disease, sedimentation, and other factors. Now, there are lots of interventions that are in place, but restoration managers need lots of tools in the toolbox and more capacity to restore. So if we're going to hit ambitious restoration targets, we want to see what we can do as ocean farmers to really bring our skills and tools to the table. And we think we could do this in 3 ways: through assisted regeneration, or in situ planting and using farm infrastructure in or near restoration sites, through transplantation of plants cultivated elsewhere, and through supporting development of nurseries and seed banking. So with the support of the Nature Conservancy California Oceans Program, and in partner with Hog Island Oyster Company, Cal Poly, and the contributions of many, many others, we set out to test this hypothesis for restoration aquaculture and launched a pilot project to investigate how ocean farmers and our farms might support restoration of bull kelp in Northern California. We have 4 pretty targeted goals for this multi-year effort. Really started, I want to say, all the way back in 2018 with ideation, starting to implement in 2019, but really didn't get the full project off the ground in the water until 2021. We have 4 goals. 1, secure a lease and permit for commercial kelp cultivation in California. 2, expand seed production capacity. 3, develop proof of concept for a dual purpose farm to support restoration and commercial use, and explore market pathways for cultivated bull kelp. So first, starting with the site. This is a particular challenge for anyone who's ever navigated or been interested and started poking around to how to lease and permit waters in the state of California for aquaculture. No new leases have been issued in California state waters for over 25 years. Access is limited, the cost of operation is pretty high, and it can be a multi-year process to get to that point. In this talk, I'm not really going to talk about that entire process, but instead hone in on kind of an area of opportunity along the North Coast. So Humboldt Bay, the largest protected body of water between San Francisco Bay and Puget Sound in Washington state. This is the land of the Wiyot people, the original caretakers and stewards of the land and waters since time immemorial. To implement proof of concept and to get a demonstration in the water, we moved forward with a site that was pre-permitted by the Humboldt Bay Harbor Recreation and Conservation District for different types of shellfish and seaweed culture. Overall, the district had pre-permitted about 21 acres for this type of production on the west side of the bay, between the jetty and the North Bay. Our 2.8 acre site with about 1 acre of farmable area is located about where that green arrow is pointing down on the left-hand picture. Through this process, we submitted a culture description to the California Coastal Commission, working with the liaison at the Harbor District. We obtained the necessary permits for broodstock collection, hatchery cultivation, and farm deployment. I do want to point out, though, this is not the type of environment where bull kelp would grow naturally. There is plenty that washes in on an incoming tide, but the water here is muddy. It is shallow, it's turbid. We do see about 40% replenishment rate of the waters of the bay on every tide. And the current moves pretty swiftly. We have measured up to 3.5 knots on an outgoing tide and pretty sustained high salinities that do drop down with increased precipitation. But on average, we're seeing around 32 parts per thousand. So next I'm going to talk about sort of the experimental design and some of the long line systems that we deployed here. Our goal was to balance the needs of restoration with the management and maintenance requirements of the ocean farmer. So rather than use a system that's staked to the bottom, like Merrill and Gillingham described in their bull kelp cultivation manual in 1991, which would require divers, we adapted longline systems that are familiar to other ocean farmers in the Northwest and compatible with other types of kelp cultivation to determine whether we could adapt this for bull kelp. A key distinction between what Merrill and Gillingham proposed and this approach is that our long lines are at a relatively fixed distance from the surface rather than from the bottom, and are maintained at depth through the use of anchors and buoys and tension across the whole system. So in this cross-sectional diagram here, I think you can see my arrow. This blue line represents the water surface, whereas this brown line represents the mud substrate in the bottom where our anchors are sitting. This line between the red buoys here is our cultivation long line. In our case, we decided to test 2 array types. First, a traditional single line array. So this is the bird's eye view of that array. If I were flying over the farm, looking down into the water column, it would just look like one straight line between 2 anchor points. And a multi-line array with 5 lines cut to equal length and attached to a rigid bar on either end of the array. The long lines are spaced, in this case, about 2.5 feet apart. The objective here was to look at ways we might be able to maximize production, but minimize the anchor footprint and compare that to the results from the single line production. Another advantage of this type of system is that it's really easy to pre-rig, to pack into a tote, to ship to a farm site or carry on a boat. It's modular, it's scalable, and it can be deployed on a small vessel with 1 or 2 people. It's also easy to remove at the end of a season or a restoration project. When we deployed this on our 1 acre site, we did it in an alternating pattern from channel to shore, oriented in a north-south direction, which also happens to be parallel to the flow of current. We deployed 3 single lines overall and 2 5-line arrays in that alternating pattern. It doesn't look like much from the surface of the water. You see a few buoys along with our regulatory marker buoys that are demarcating the perimeter of our farm site. The second objective of our project was to expand seed production capacity. Now, we did this over a period of years, working first with a professor and students at Humboldt State University, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt, to design and establish a small lab for producing bull kelp seed string. You too can learn about seed and nursery production if you're interested by visiting the courses and lessons on GreenWave's Ocean Farming Hub at hub.greenwave.org. The students of Rafael Cuevas Uribe at Cal Poly used the lab to produce seed string for the GreenWave pilot site, as well as a research project on an adjacent site run by the university. In these pictures on the left, you can see graduate student Kalani Ortiz, integral part of this effort, showing visitors in the lab a nursery setup that she used to assess different seed stocking densities and seed string types in an experiment that she was trying to run this past year. On the right-hand side, you see the team along with my esteemed colleague, Karen Gray, who, without her work, this project would not be possible. And everyone's getting the seed spools ready, loading them up into canisters to bring them out to the farm site. Here, Kalani is showing us that chocolatey brown spool she produced for our farm as we pack them up for outplanting. You'll note that here we see kind of a glass aquaria with the spools inside. In the previous picture, we saw some other tank setups. Kalani and the students tested a couple of different types of production and systems in the lab. One ripe source packet, though, should be noted, can yield millions of spores. In the bull kelp cultivation manual that I mentioned earlier, compiled by Marilyn Gillingham, they recommended a stocking density of between 1,000 and 5,000 spores per milliliter. In the first year of our pilot, Kalani set a stocking density to approximately 1,500 spores per mill, and we observed that this was probably more than enough, and lower densities might actually yield larger kelps at the end of the season. So this past season, the 2022 to 23 farm year, Kalani attempted an experiment to compare different stocking densities ranging from 250 spores per mill to 2,000 spores per mill. Unfortunately, that was impacted by all of those atmospheric rivers, but Kalani is working on summarizing all of her research. More on the atmospheric rivers in a minute. In addition to getting Cal Poly set up to produce seed for the pilot and research studies, funding from this project also helped Sunken Seaweed, a seaweed-based company that started in San Diego and also has a location in Humboldt, help them to establish a more production-oriented lab and kelp nursery in a shipping container in coordination with Hog Island Oyster Company, whose site this facility is located on. The lab supports Sunken Seaweed's land-based culture tanks, as well as the open water kelp production in Humboldt Bay. So the third component of this project and our third objective was to test and improve that dual purpose model for both commercial cultivation and restoration. The reason for this approach follows some of the efforts we've seen across the oyster industry, among others, where farmers have the economic incentive to monitor and maintain their crops. In addition to the restorative benefits that's associated with farming oysters, there are creative incentives in place, such as the SOAR program, where restoration managers can buy oversized oysters from farmers and use them to seed oyster beds or reefs. Would something similar work for kelp farmers? We wanted to explore that question. Before I share the next set of slides, I want to orient you first to the fact that we ended up with some great results. We were surprised, in fact, by some of the things that we could achieve by cultivating bull kelp in Humboldt Bay, but it was not without its challenges. So here we've got pictures of the seed spools as they're unfurling on our long lines. At the first outplanting in 2021, in fall of 2021, around October, everyone was full of optimism and verve. And it wasn't until a few months later that we saw only about half of the seed string that we had deployed had survived that early outplanting. So sort of by accident, we ended up doing another trial outplanting later in the spring and testing the possibility of sort of staging or staggering those outplantings over the course of the season and trying to understand how that might impact yield and productivity and these other things at the end of the year. We did this a little bit more intentionally in the second year of the project, but also in experienced some significant hurdles, namely precipitation. So when we outplant our seed spools on the farm depends on a number of factors. We're usually collecting the source tissue, the reproductive tissue from our bull kelp in the wild. And so when it's available to be collected, it also depends on the weather window. Can we actually get out to do the collection? And once we've collected and reared those spools, incubated in the hatchery over multiple weeks, do we have the weather window to get out onto a boat to outplant them onto the farm? I've had some conversations with folks at Puget Sound Restoration Fund over the years, and several of their team members had noted that they identified February as a really good outplanting window for bull kelp longlines for restoration in Puget Sound. What we had in 2021 initially was an October outplanting. You can see identified by this red line. The green sort of brackets here over this calendar indicate our approximate farming season for 2021 and 22. We outplanted again in March. In the 2022 and 23 season, with this sort of gray bar shading the calendar, we managed to outplant in mid-December and again in March. What I'm also showing you here is our precipitation in Eureka over the past 3 years. And so you can see in our farm season and with the atmospheric rivers that occurred in 2022 and 23, we had far more precipitation over that winter season than previously. And with that, we had some staggered results, some differing results across farm seasons. As I mentioned before, with our initial outplanting, we had about half of our seed string survive. It wasn't until January or February that we were starting to see any signs of growth. During the second farm season, once we were able to finally get back out onto the water with all the inclement weather, we found that, about 90% of our lines were just completely bare. And there was only one line with some sporophyte development. So we went back to the drawing board, managed to collect source tissue again for production, worked with Kalani and the team at Cal Poly to again produce seed string, and did another outplanting later in the season. So this is an effort to condense a lot of the things that happened over 2 farm seasons. So I am jogging back and forth just a little bit, but wanted to give you a sense of what things were looking like right after we did the second outplanting in the 2022 farm season, where half of our material survived and half didn't. So you can clearly see where things remained on the line. They really started to take off very quickly in early spring. And you can clearly see that on these long lines here. By April, May, June, we had really robust growth along our long lines. The material that was outplanted later in the spring in March really took off pretty quickly, but it reached sort of a smaller size overall before the water temperatures in the bay increased to a point where, the growth had tapered off overall. One thing that I want to point out in this picture, or these pair of pictures here, is the long lines on the multi-line array next to one another. And so what you can see here is more well-developed sporophytes, and this is from the fall outplanting, where the material survived the winter. And this is from the March outplanting, where things started to grow very quickly, very consistent density, but were smaller overall. And this is another picture of what it looks like towards the end of the season as we're beginning to harvest our long lines. Biomass in both years kind of peaked in early June as water temperatures increased over 16 to 17 degrees Celsius. I would also just point out the sort of murkiness of the water that we're working with. One of the really interesting things that we observed was for that material that we outplanted in the fall and that persisted through the winter and spring as we had ample sorus production. We noted more robust sorus across this fall outplanted material. We did a presence absence count this past year. We did not observe much, if any, on the material that was outplanted later in the spring. And so we're hypothesizing that if we're producing for restoration initiatives, and one of those objectives might be to produce sorus for spore bagging, we'd want to attempt some earlier outplantings to try to stimulate that growth and source production. Across the seasons, we noticed that this was pretty consistent. One of the challenges that we encountered in the first year of the project, though, was that as the stipes grow, they get very long and they're shifting back and forth north-south in the tide. Those stipes really want to get wound around one another. That can present some challenges to harvest and handling. When the lines on the multi-line array were very close to one another, this also presented some issues with the adjacent lines, kind of the stipes from the adjacent lines starting to wrap around the stipes from the other, really sucking that in and making it more or less one line. So in the second year of our project, we decided to cut out a couple of the lines on the multi-line, move from 5 lines to 3. Now, I'm just going to throw out some numbers here from this past farm season and also point out the difference in the size of the material that I've alluded to that was outplanted in the fall versus outplanted in the spring. You see on the left-hand side, our farm manager, Tori Pelosi, and the Hog Island farm manager, Warren, here demonstrating the length of those fronds. You don't even get the full stipe in that image. And then the much smaller material that was outplanted in the spring on the right-hand side. The one line that persisted over the year, this past year, only produced about 350 pounds of material, but we did have lots of sorus production on those ample fronds. The remaining 8 long lines, which were outplanted on March 31st, were harvested in mid-June. That seed only spent about 80 days in the water, but it yielded around 4,200 pounds of bull kelp. We're still crunching numbers on a lot of these things to compare across farm seasons. But one thing that we didn't really observe this past year was much of a difference in production between the density and the biomass on each of the lines on the multi-line array versus a single line. So the multi-line sort of presents some opportunities to have greater production with the same anchor footprint. Okay, the fourth piece that I'm going to touch on before sort of wrapping up this presentation and jumping into Q&A is our fourth objective, explore market pathways. So when GreenWave works with farmers across the country, really promote the whole leaf or whole kelp strategy when looking at different markets and ways of kind of selling kelp and diversifying your revenue generation opportunities. We promote primarily looking at food, so value-added products and ingredients, things like bioplastics. There are companies in California that are working on plastic alternatives for thin film packaging, as well as straws, and then agricultural applications like biostimulants and compost and feed. But that is missing one core component of this project and the objectives of this work, and that's restoration. And so really looking at, is there a market potential also for restoration? Do we look at that in exactly the same way? So with restoration, we should be looking at sorus for spore bags or seed banks, juvenile transplants, and one thing that we learned this past year, there's an opportunity for feedstock for urchin traps. So just kind of running through those different uses of the whole kelp strategy, I want to give a shout out to Sunken Seaweed again and our friends Leslie and Tori, as well as the Hog Island Oyster Company, who's really helped us over the past couple of years to explore different pathways for kelp cultivation. Leslie and Tori harvested quite a bit of this bull kelp and dried it in a greenhouse. They're looking at different possible food uses. Hog Island has expressed some interest in doing some tests in their commissary kitchen. While Sway did not source bull kelp from our Humboldt farm this past year, I have to give a shout out to Julia Marsh, who made the trek all the way to Humboldt Bay to see what this work is all about. Bull kelps are rich in alginate, have lots of potential for plastic alternative products, but the volume of material that's needed for these types of applications is really beyond what we're able to produce at this site at this time. In the first year of the project, material also went to different agricultural applications in the first and second year. We had a company that manufactures soil amendments, Pacific Northwest Organics, that has in the past used wild harvest material, but pressure on wild stocks and quotas that are in place for bull kelp harvest across Humboldt County. There's a possible demand for kelp, but without a free-flowing supply. Cultivated kelps have the potential to replace or supplement materials that are wild harvested or industries that are using that wild harvest, further giving stocks a chance to recover. Other material went to a local farm. I think we've got this video is unloading the stipes onto the back of a truck, and it was incorporated into compost. And still other material, lots of samples from the farm was sent to a lab at Eurofins to do a comprehensive tissue analysis, and the conclusion of which was it was food grade and, I quote, good enough for baby food. In this past farm season, a majority of our biomass was delivered to a large regenerative dairy farm where it was used in feed and soil amendment trials. And another portion of material was used as a feedstock for a biostimulant trial that GreenWave is conducting in coordination with another for-profit partner. Using the whole kelp from holdfast to blade tip, the material has been fermenting since June, and the resulting slurry and liquid has just been sent to our Eurofins lab and another lab for analysis. So more to come on that in the future. As I mentioned before, there's other potential uses and applications to support restoration, but one that we were really encouraged by and didn't so much expect this season is the need for kelp for urchin traps. So this is Grant Downey, who you may have come across in the past if you're involved in kelp restoration or urchin ranching or farming or collection, across the California coast. And here, as a part of an effort with the Nature Conservancy, he's rigging a bull kelp to an urchin trap off the coast of Fort Bragg. Now, this picture was taken back in 2021, so no credit to our project directly, but what Tristan McHugh through the Nature Conservancy found this year is that they needed material for these urchin traps at a time when that beach cast material was not showing up. And that coincided around the time of our harvest of the kelps in Humboldt Bay. So we were able to redirect a portion of the harvested material from those cultivated lines over to these urchin traps to help to attract more urchin. So in summary, we learned lots of things over the course of this multi-year project. One is that multiple outplantings are entirely possible. They might support different end uses, but we also have to be mindful of weather patterns and precipitation and kind of further hone in and experiment to find that ideal timeline. I think there's promise to show that lower stocking densities are also possible for seed, which would allow you to seed more long lines and more material with a smaller quantity of material, but we need more data to support firm recommendations. With the multi-line array system, the 5-foot spacing, I think overall worked better than the 2.5-foot spacing, but we need to optimize those methods for improved quality and for an intended end use. The least costs are not a thing that I really talked about during this presentation, but happy to take questions about that. Lease costs are relatively high relative to other states. Multi-species farming, grants, low interest loans, and sort of a mixed system of production might help to defray those costs and make the bottom line pencil out. And it's clear that there are some existing and emerging markets for cultivated bull kelp. So next steps, we have a lot in mind for where we'd like to see this work go and how we'd like to see it continue. A few things that I think could happen in the coming years is we connect this pilot with actual target restoration sites above and beyond things like urchin trapping. We expand seed banks and nursery production capacity, explore in situ assisted restoration, utilizing the cultivation techniques and infrastructure, and optimize bull kelp nursery and farm production to support this dual use. I'd like to say thank you and offer some acknowledgements both to my co-authors on this work as well as to the many others who contributed along the way, who advising, support, answering questions, and providing other resources. I'm looking forward to taking questions, and also encourage you to reach out to me and explore the other programming and resources that GreenWave has to offer. You can find us at our website at greenwave.org, and to look at some of our online resources through our online hub, greenwave.org/hub, or if you're interested in some of the market development pieces, /seaweed source. Thank you so much.